I've worked as a psychiatric nurse for just over 14 years now. Acute admissions, locked observation units, nights mostly. Enough time that very little surprises me anymore. What happened on April 17, 2019 still does. Not because it was dramatic, but because it fit nowhere in my training, my charts, or my sense of what patients can perceive. It started like any other night shift. I clocked in at 18:58, signed out the narcotics log, checked staffing. We were short one tech, which was becoming routine. I was assigned to the high acuity podate rooms, all locked, all patients on either involuntary holds or close observation. My job was medication administration, behavioral assessments, and hourly documentation. Room 214 had been flagged during handover, male patient, early 40s. Admitted 3 days prior under a Section 12 hold for acute psychosis with catatonic features. He'd barely spoken since arrival. No aggression, no hallucinations reported because, frankly, he wasn't reporting anything at all. He lay still for hours at a time, eyes open, blinking infrequently. We charted withdrawn, minimally responsive. Psychiatry was considering ECT, if there was no change. At 21:30, I did my first round. Vitals stable. Heart rate low, but acceptable. He didn't react when I spoke his name. No eye tracking. No resistance when I adjusted his blanket. His chart said nonverbal since admission. That mattered later. The first thing that felt off happened at 23:47. I was at the nurse's station finishing a behavioral note when the call light from 214 activated. That alone wasn't strange sometimes. Patients hit buttons reflexively. But when I checked the monitor, he was still lying flat, hands visible on the mattress, nowhere near the wall panel. I went in anyway. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. That's important on psych and never assume intent. He didn't move, but his eyes shifted slightly. Toward me. That was new. Subtle, but unmistakable. I noted it mentally. Eye contact initiation. Possible improvement. I reset the call light and left. At 1:12, it happened again. Same thing. Light on, patient motionless. This time, when I entered the room, he whispered, "You're late." It took me a second to register that he'd spoken at all. 3 days of silence, then a full sentence, calm, clear. No disorganization, no effect. "I'm sorry," I said. He didn't repeat it. His gaze returned to the ceiling. I documented first verbalization observed. I should have escalated immediately, but on nights you learn to balance urgency with pattern. One sentence doesn't change a treatment plan. At 2:17, during my hourly checks, I noticed something else. His charting binder kept outside the room was open to my notes from earlier in the shift. I was certain I'd closed it. We're strict about that. HIPAA isn't optional. I assumed I'd been careless. At 3:04, he spoke again. This time before I said anything. "You write slower when you're tired," he said. I asked him what he meant. He didn't respond. But he turned his head fully this time. Man looked directly at the observation window. I hadn't written anything in his room. All documentation was electronic. The only writing I'd done was at the station, out of his line of sight. At 4:30, psychiatry requested neuro checks due to the sudden verbal engagement. I went in with a pen light. As I assessed pupil response, he said my full name, first and last. Staff badges on our unit only show first names. I felt my stomach drop, not from fear but from confusion. That's worse. Fear has protocols. "How do you know that?" I asked. He shrugged. A small movement. The first voluntary motion I'd seen from him. "It's in the margins," he said. At 5:10, during chart review, I noticed something I still can't explain. In the electronic record under nursing comments, there were 2 entries time-stamped during my break, written in my charting style. My abbreviations, my phrasing. I did not write them. It later confirmed the login was mine. The patient was transferred to a different facility later that morning for neurological evaluation. IG was normal, MRI, unremarkable. By afternoon, he'd stopped speaking again. I never saw him after that shift. I still work psych nights. I still believe in diagnoses, in dissociation, in the limits of consciousness. But I'm more careful now about what I assume patients aren't aware of, especially when they requiet, because some of them are watching much more closely than we think. I was 6 years into psychiatric nursing when this happened, working permanent nights in a locked behavioral health unit attached to a general hospital. It was August 3, 2020. COVID protocols were still in full force. Staffing was thin, and everyone was tired in a way that seeps into your judgment if you let it. The patient in room 37 was admitted under an emergency detention order just before midnight. Female, late 20s, brought in by police after being found sitting in traffic, unmoving, not responding to verbal commands. No substances on board, no injuries, no prior psychiatric history we could access at the time. By 0:41, she was settled in the room, door locked, observation status every 15 minutes. She sat upright on the bed, hands folded in her lap, eyes open, no agitation, no distress, just still. That kind of presentation usually points toward dissociation or acute stress response. It's not rare. What was unusual was how precisely still she was. No fidgeting, no shifting weight. Even her breathing was shallow and slow. At 1 o'clock, I did my first formal assessment. She didn't respond to her name, didn't track my movement, didn't blink when I waved my hand slowly across her field of vision. Pain stimulus sternal rub produced no reaction. I documented unresponsive, awake, non-catatonic. That distinction matters. At 1:46, while I was charting at the station, I felt the sensation that someone was standing behind me. I turned. No one there. Just the hallway monitor showing the live feeds from each room. Room 37's camera was angled slightly wrong. That alone wouldn't bother me, except I knew I'd checked it myself less than an hour earlier. We're trained to notice that. Camera angles don't shift on their own. Maintenance requires a work order. Nothing had been logged. I went to adjust it. When I entered the room, she spoke without turning her head. "You don't need to fix it," she said. Her voice was flat, uninflected, not emotional, not confused. I froze for a moment, then asked her how she was feeling. She didn't answer. She remained seated, eyes forward, but her jaw tightened slightly, as if she was holding something back. I documented verbalization, observed. Psychiatry would want to know. At 2:30, she pressed the call button. When I arrived, she asked what time it was. I told her. She nodded, like she'd been confirming something. Then she asked how long I'd been watching her. "I check on all my patients," I said. "That's the correct answer." She looked at me then. Direct eye contact, clear, focused. "No," she said. "I mean before tonight." I escalated to the on-call psychiatrist. They recommended continued observation. No meds unless agitation developed. She wasn't a danger. She was calm, or appeared to be. At 3:58, during routine rounds, I noticed my badge was missing. I retraced my steps. Nurse's station, medroom, supply closet. It was on the desk inside room 307. She hadn't left the bed. The door logs confirmed it. No staff had entered between my last check and that moment. I asked her how it got there. She said, "You drop things when you're thinking about other people." I took my badge and left. My hands were shaking, but not visibly. You learn how to control that. At 5:12, I reviewed the overnight footage with security. There was a 4-minute gap in the recording from room 307. No explanation, no system alert. She was transferred out later that day, once a medical bed opened, diagnosis pending, possible dissociative disorder, possible acute stress reaction. Before transport arrived, I went in one last time to complete paperwork. She finally lay down, eyes closed. As I turned to leave, she said quietly, You don't write about the parts you're not supposed to notice. I didn't ask what she meant. I still don't know whether she was talking about herself or about me. I was working the observation wing that night, the part of the psychiatric unit reserved for patients who were not violent, but weren't considered fully conscious of their actions either. I'd been a psychiatric nurse for 11 years at that point. It was February 11th, 2018. Snowstorm outside. Quiet inside, in the way that only happens after 2 o'clock. Room 119 held an older male patient, late 60s. Voluntary admission. Former engineer, according to intake. He'd come in complaining of memory lapses and blank spells. No psychosis, no delusions. Neurology had cleared him earlier that week. Psychiatry labeled it adjustment disorder with dissociative features. Observation only. He was polite, oriented, slightly anxious. The kind of patient you don't expect trouble from. At 2:14, I did his routine check. He was asleep on his side, breathing evenly. I noted it and moved on. At 2:46, the call light from 119 came on. When I entered, he was sitting upright, blanket folded neatly beside him. "I think I missed something," he said. I asked him what he meant. "Time," he replied. "There's a part missing." That isn't unusual language for memory complaints. I reassured him, asked grounding questions. He answered all of them correctly. Date, location, my first name read from my badge. Then he asked, "Did I speak to you earlier?" I told him no. He nodded, but not like someone accepting reassurance, more like someone filing information away. At 3:21, while charting, I noticed an addendum had appeared in his record. Time-stamped 2:18, 4 minutes after I'd last seen him asleep. It read, "Patient reports awareness during unrecorded interval." I hadn't written that. No one else had access to my login. I checked the audit trail. It showed my credentials. Terminal at the nurse's station. I was in the medication room at that exact time. There's camera footage to prove it. At 3:40 I went back to his room. He was lying down again, eyes open. "I didn't want you to get in trouble," he said calmly. "That's why I didn't say it out loud." I asked him what he thought had happened. He swallowed before answering. "I don't think I stop," he said. "I think you stop noticing." That sentence stayed with me more than anything else that night. At 4:55, he requested water. As I handed it to him, he asked me how long patients usually remember things that aren't written down. I told him memories fade. That's generally true. He smiled faintly. "Then it should be fine," he said. Later that morning, neuro reevaluated him. Cognitive testing normal. MRI unchanged. He was discharged 2 days later with outpatient follow-up. Before he left, he shook my hand and thanked me for keeping the gaps small. I still don't know what he meant by that. But since then, whenever I document overnight observations, I double-check the timestamps, not because I'm afraid of making a mistake, but because I'm no longer certain the record reflects everything that happens when we think no one is aware. By my 9th year as a psychiatric nurse, I'd learned that adolescents can be more unsettling than adults, not because they're unpredictable, but because they notice inconsistencies most people ignore. This happened on November 6, 2021, during a run of overnight shifts in a secure adolescent behavioral unit. The patient was in room 412, 16 years old. Admitted under an involuntary hold after repeated episodes of selective mutism and prolonged dissociative states at school. No history of psychosis, no self-harm, IQ testing above average. Teachers described her as present, but elsewhere, she arrived at 1920, cooperative, compliant, silent. She followed instructions without hesitation, changed into unit clothing, sat on the bed with her hands folded, eyes open, watching. At 21 o'clock, I completed intake observations. She didn't respond verbally, but she tracked my movements. When I asked yes or no questions, She blinked once or twice appropriately. I documented nonverbal responsive to nonverbal cues. At 22:38, during routine hallway rounds, she stood up for the first time. She walked to the door and stood just inside the observation window, close enough that I could see the condensation from her breath on the glass. She didn't press the call button. She waited. I entered, asked if she needed something. She shook her head. I asked her to return to the bed. She did, immediately. No resistance. No delay. At 23:57, the night tech told me room 412 had been standing again. Same behavior. No request. No agitation. Just watching the hallway. At 0:44, I reviewed the observation logs. Her room had a higher than average number of checks documented already. Not because policy required it, but because staff felt compelled to look. At 1:18, she finally spoke. I was adjusting the Vitos cart outside her door when she said, softly, "You're going to skip to 30. I stopped and looked at her. "What do you mean?" I asked. She didn't answer. She lay back down and turned her face to the wall. At 2:30, I realized I had missed her check. Not intentionally. I'd done every other room, documented all of them. Somehow, room 412 wasn't on the list I was following. The unit checklist showed it as complete, initialed with my handwriting. I know my handwriting. I went in immediately. She was awake. "You fixed it," she said quietly. "That's good." I asked her what she thought would have happened if I hadn't. She took a long time to answer. "People forget to look," she said. "Then they say nothing happened." At 3:40, psychiatry was notified. They recommended continued observation, possible dissociative disorder with hypervigilance. That label didn't sit right with me, but it was the closest fit. Before morning shift arrived, she asked me one last question. "Do you remember me from before?" I told her no. She nodded, like she'd expected that. She was discharged a week later to an outpatient program. No further incidents, no behavioral escalation. I still work nights. And I still make a point, on every shift, to double-check rooms that feel too quiet. Because some patients aren't trying to escape. They're trying to make sure someone is paying attention. By the time this happened, I'd been a psychiatric nurse for nearly 13 years. Mostly nights, mostly locked adult units. You learn the difference between patients who want attention and patients who are afraid of what happens when attention stops. This was the second kind. It was June 22, 2017. I was assigned to a short-stay, psychiatric observation unit rooms designed for 24 to 72-hour holds. Room 228 housed a middle-aged woman, early 50s, admitted after collapsing at work. Coworkers reported she'd been awake but gone for several minutes. No seizure activity. No stroke. Toxicology clean. Her chart listed depersonalization derealization disorder. No prior inpatient history. She was articulate, cooperative, and visibly embarrassed to be there. At 2010, during admission assessment, she answered every question appropriately. Mood anxious, thought process linear, insight intact. She apologized more than necessary. That alone isn't diagnostic, but it's something nurses notice. At 21:55, she asked if I could leave the door partially open. "Not policy," I said, "but I'll be right outside." She nodded, then asked, "If I stop responding, will you still chart me as present?" That was an odd way to phrase it. I told her yes, presence is assessed, not assumed. She seemed relieved by that answer. At 23:30, she was resting quietly, eyes closed, breathing steady. I documented appears asleep. At 0:18, she pressed the call button. When I entered, she was sitting up, pale but composed. "I think it happened again," she said. I asked her what she remembered. "I remember starting to go," she said slowly. "And then I remember you writing that I was still here. I hadn't written anything yet. Not since 23:30. I asked her how long she thought she'd been gone. "For minutes," she said. maybe 5. You always wait a little before you write. That was true. Most nurses do. You observe first. Document after. At 1:02, during routine checks, I noticed her room had been marked as awake. Calm at 0:30. I hadn't made that entry. The system audit showed my credentials. Correct terminal, correct timestamp. But I was in another patient's room at that time, administering medication, witnessed by a tech. At 1:40, she asked me something I still think about. "If you write that I'm here," she said, "does that make it true?" I didn't answer right away. There isn't a protocol response for that. She didn't press me. She lay back down and stared at the ceiling. At 2:55, I noticed something subtle but wrong. Her vitals monitor showed continuous data heart rate, oxygen saturation with no interruption. But during that same period, I realized I had no memory of seeing her during checks. The documentation existed. The data existed. My recollection didn't. At 4:10, she finally slept. Real sleep this time. REM visible, breathing uneven. In the morning, she had no memory of speaking to me overnight. None of the questions, none of the concern. She thanked me for staying nearby and was discharged later that afternoon without patient follow-up. Before she left, she paused at the door and said, almost casually, "You do a good job keeping people from disappearing. I still document carefully, precisely, conservatively, but I'm more aware now that charting isn't just a record of what we see. Sometimes, it's the only proof someone was still there." I was assigned to the seclusion-capable wing that night, the part of the unit we only use when patients are at risk of losing behavioral control. I'd been a psychiatric nurse for just over 10 years. This was October 14th, 2016. Overnight shifts. Low census. The kind of night where you expect boredom, not complications. Room 506 held a male patient in his early 30s. Admitted involuntarily after a workplace incident where he became unresponsive mid-conversation. No aggression, no substances, no psychosis noted. EMS reported he'd been awake the entire time, eyes open, posture maintained, but didn't respond to voice, pain, or ammonia salts. The admitting psychiatrist documented possible dissociative stupor. Observation level, continuous. At 21:12, I completed my initial assessment. He sat on the bed, hands on knees, spine straight. When I asked him questions, his eyes moved toward me, but he didn't speak. No agitation, no distress. He complied with every request, stood when asked, sat when told without hesitation, like he was following instructions he'd already memorized. At 22:05, the tech assigned to sit outside his room asked if I'd noticed how timed he was. "What do you mean?" I asked. "He blinks every time the hallway clock clicks," she said. I watched for a full minute. She was right. At 23:18, I relieved the tech briefly so she could take her break. I sat outside the door, documenting. The patient remained still. At exactly 23:30, without looking at me, he said, "You switched chairs." I had. 5 minutes earlier. He hadn't turned his head. I asked him how he knew. "I keep count," he said. I asked him what he was counting. "Intervals," he replied. Nothing more. At 0:47, during continuous observation, he stood up on his own. No cue, no agitation. He walked 3 steps toward the door and stopped. I instructed him to return to the bed. He did. Immediately, I documented the behavior. Or at least, I thought I did. At 1:15, I reviewed my notes and realized the entry wasn't there. The time slot was filled, correct wording, correct formatting, but it described him as unchanged, seated throughout observation. That wasn't true. The audit trail showed my login. No edits, no anomalies. At 2:02, he spoke again. "You missed one," he said. I asked him what he meant. "A stand," he replied. "It didn't get written." I felt a tightening in my chest, not panic, but the sensation you get when something violates a system you trust. At 3:10, I asked him directly if he remembered standing earlier. Yes, he said. You told me to sit. I asked him why he thought it wasn't documented. He considered that longer than any question I'd asked him so far. Because you weren't watching then, he said. You were recording. At 4:30, Psychiatry was notified. They ordered continued observation and deferred medication. He remained calm, cooperative, oriented when he chose to answer. By morning, he stopped speaking again. He was transferred to a neuropsychiatric unit later that day. No definitive diagnosis. Dissociative spectrum was noted. Possible conversion features. I never found an explanation for the missing documentation. It couldn't replicate it. Security footage showed me seated outside his room the entire time. What unsettled me wasn't that something went wrong. It was that the patient noticed the gap before I did. Since then, I've learned to treat observation as more than watching behavior. Some patients are tracking us just as carefully, waiting to see what gets noticed and what quietly slips through. I'd been a psychiatric nurse for 12 years when this one happened. Adult acute ward. Locked unit. Mostly mood disorders and brief psychotic episodes. Nothing unusual on paper. It was March 9, 2022, and I was covering a double nights rolling straight into mornings because the staff had called out. Room 331 housed a male patient in his late 50s. Admitted voluntarily after presenting to the emergency department with complaints of losing time while awake. No substance use. No psychosis. No neurological findings. He was calm, articulate, and unusually specific about his symptoms, which clinicians often appreciate. During intake at 2040, he explained it this way: I don't black out. I'm present. I just don't seem to be. Counted. That was his word. Counted. At 21:25, I did his first check. He was seated at the small desk in his room, hands folded, staring at the wall. He turned when I spoke his name, responded appropriately, no concerns. At 20:10, I documented him as awake.com, reading. He hadn't been reading, but he'd picked up the book on his table. It felt close enough. We do that sometimes, use shorthand when nothing clinically significant is happening. At 23:02, he pressed the call button. You wrote something that didn't happen, he said. I asked him what he meant. I wasn't reading, he said. I was waiting. I corrected the note immediately. It wasn't a big deal. But when I refreshed the chart, the original entry was already gone as if it had never existed. Audit trails showed no edits. At 0:36, during rounds, he was standing by the observation window. Not close, not touching it, just standing there, eyes level with the glass. You're missing one again, he said. I asked him what he thought I was missing. He hesitated, then said, the part where I'm still here even when you don't write it. At 1:20, I reviewed the unit census. All patients accounted for. All observations documented. But room 331 had a 15-minute gap, no entry. No alert, no red flag. That shouldn't be possible. The system auto-prompts. At 1:35, I went in. He was sitting on the bed, hands folded exactly as before. You didn't see me for a bit, he said calmly. That's when it happens. I asked him what it was. He shook his head. It's not an event, he said. It's an omission. At 2:50, fatigue hit hard. The kind where time feels slightly distorted. I sat down at the nurse's station to chart and realized I couldn't remember the last round clearly. The notes were there, my initials, my wording. But the memory wasn't. At 3:30, he spoke for the last time that night. You should stop fixing it, he said. It makes it harder to notice when it's real. He was discharged 2 days later, without patient follow-up. Diagnosis, depersonalization disorder. No safety concerns. Cooperative throughout. I still believe that diagnosis fits. But now, When I chart, I'm more aware of how often we use documentation to reassure ourselves that someone is present, stable, accounted for, and how unsettling it is to consider that sometimes the record feels more certain than our own awareness. I was working in a mixed-gender psychiatric intensive care unit at the time. Locked doors, limited beds, high staff-to-patient ratio. I'd been a psychiatric nurse for just over 15 years. This was January 27, 2015, a night shift that began quietly and stayed that way at least on the surface. Room 604 was occupied by a woman in her early 40s. Involuntary admission. History of treatment-resistant depression with dissociative episodes. No psychosis, no mania. She'd been transferred to us because she kept reporting that staff were forgetting her for short periods of time. That was the word she used, forgetting. At 19:45, I did her intake review. She was calm, articulate, and tired in a way I recognized. The kind of exhaustion that comes from having to explain yourself repeatedly and not being believed. "They keep telling me I'm stable," she said. "But that's only because they don't notice when I'm not." I noted it as subjective distress. That's how you're trained to phrase things. At 21:10, during routine checks, she was lying in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. She acknowledged me when I spoke. No concerns. At 22 o'clock, she requested a notebook. "What for?" I asked. "So I can prove I was awake," she said. I hesitated, then provided one. Patients are allowed personal writing materials. She began writing immediately, carefully, like someone copying something rather than composing. At 23:26, I passed by her room and noticed she had stopped writing. The notebook was open on the bed, pen placed neatly along the spine. "You okay?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "I'm just waiting." "For what?" "For the part you don't see." At 0:05, while charting, I noticed something odd. Her observation entries were present, complete, and unremarkable. But I couldn't recall actually performing the last one. I could picture standing at her door, but the memory felt flat, like a still image. At 0:40, she pressed the call button. "You didn't write that one," she said. I checked the system. The entry was there, timestamped, initialed. "I did," I said. She shook her head slowly. "You wrote about it," she said. "That's not the same." At 1:18, I asked her what she'd been writing in the notebook. She handed it to me. The pages weren't narratives. They were timestamps, lines of numbers, gaps between them circled in pen. Next to one circled gap, she'd written, "This is when it happens." I asked her what happened during that gap. She looked at me for a long time before answering. "Nothing," she said. "That's the problem." At 2:10, I experienced something I still struggle to describe. I was standing at the nurse's station, mid-sentence with another nurse, when I suddenly realized I didn't know what time it was. Not approximately, not even which hour. The charting system showed 2:12. I had no memory of the previous check round. The documentation was complete. My initials were there. At 3 o'clock, she was asleep, real sleep. The notebook closed on the bedside table. In the morning, she remembered none of the conversation. She didn't recognize the notebook as hers. It was logged and returned with her belongings anyway. She was transferred to a longer-term facility 2 days later. I still think about something she said early that night, that staff weren't noticing her absence, only her stability. Because once you work in psych long enough, you realize how much of care depends on continuity of attention, and how disturbing it is to consider what might happen in the moments where attention quietly, briefly fails. By the time this happened, I'd stopped trusting the word uneventful. I was 14 years into psychiatric nursing, working nights on an adult locked unit that handled short-term crisis stabilization. This was September 18, 2014. Staffing was adequate, census was low, no environmental stressors to explain what followed. Room 118 was occupied by a man in his early 30s. Voluntary admission, software engineer, no prior psychiatric hospitalizations. He presented to the emergency department reporting that he was responding normally without experiencing the response. That phrase was quoted verbatim in the intake note. At 2025, during admission assessment, he was polite, calm, and precise with language. Affect flat but appropriate. Thought process linear. He answered every question correctly, sometimes before I finished asking. At one point he paused and said, "You're going to write that I'm cooperative?" "Yes," I said, "because you are." He nodded. "That's what worries me." At 21:40, I completed his first check. He was sitting on the bed, hands folded, staring at the door. When I spoke his name, he responded immediately. At 22:30, he asked if he could stand during observation. "As long as you stay in the room," I said. He stood by the wall, facing the corner, not in distress, just positioned there deliberately. At 23:12, while documenting, I noticed something subtle but wrong. His observation note didn't reflect his position. It read seated.com. I corrected it. When I refreshed the screen, the correction was gone. Not overridden, not edited. Simply absent. At 0:08, he pressed the call button. "You fixed it again," he said. I asked him what he meant. "You keep correcting the parts where I'm not, where you expect me to be," he said. But that's when I noticed myself most clearly. At 1 o'clock, during rounds, I realized I'd walked past his room without checking it. Not because I was distracted, but because I was certain I already had. The chart showed I had. Timestamp 0:45, initialed I had no memory of entering the room. At 1:22, I went in. He was sitting on the floor, back against the wall, eyes open, calm. "You skipped it," he said. I apologized. "That's the instinct when something procedural goes wrong." "You didn't," he replied. "You just didn't register me." I asked him what he felt during those periods. He thought for a moment. "Relief," he said, and then panic. "Because if no one's observing, I'm not sure I finish happening." At 2:40, I began to feel the strain of the shift-heavy eyelids, slight disorientation. I checked the time repeatedly. Each time, it felt like I'd just checked it moments before. At 3:15, I noticed his room had 2 overlapping observation entries for the same time, same wording, same initials, slightly different timestamps. It later told me that shouldn't be possible. By morning he was still calm, still cooperative. Psychiatry documented depersonalization with intact reality testing. He was discharged the following day. As he left, he turned and said something quietly, not unkindly. "You're very good at keeping things consistent," he said. "Just be careful what you rely on when you're tired. I still work nights. And now, when I feel too certain that I've already checked a room, I check it anyway." By the time this happened, I'd already learned to be cautious about what I dismissed as fatigue. I was 16 years into psychiatric nursing, working permanent nights in a locked adult unit attached to a teaching hospital. This was May 4, 2023. Staffing was stable, systems were functioning, there were no outages, no emergencies, nothing that would later serve as an explanation. Room 409 held a male patient in his mid-40s. Involuntary admission following a welfare check. Neighbors reported he'd been standing in his apartment hallway for hours, eyes open, responding politely when spoken to but not moving unless prompted. No aggression, no delusions, no hallucinations. Medical clearance was clean. His admitting diagnosis was unspecified dissociative disorder. Observation every 15 minutes. At 19:30, I completed my assessment. He was calm, oriented, cooperative, affect flat but appropriate. When I asked how he was feeling, he said, "Present." For now, I noted it as vague but non-psychotic. At 20:45, during rounds, he was seated on the bed, hands folded, eyes open. He acknowledged me. Nothing remarkable. At 21:58, he asked me a question that didn't make sense until much later. Do you ever feel like you arrive somewhere slightly after yourself? He asked. I gave a neutral response. Patients ask philosophical questions sometimes. It's part of the job not to overinterpret. At 22:30, I documented him as awake.com, in bed. That was accurate. At 23:14, while reviewing the unit census, I noticed room 409 had been checked twice within the same minute. Same wording, same initials, 2 separate entries. I assumed it was a system lag. At 0:06, he pressed the call button. You came in, he said, but you didn't stay. I asked him what he meant. You looked at me, he said. You just weren't there yet. I checked the chart. The entry existed, time-stamped correct. I had no memory of entering the room at that time. At 1:10, I felt something I can only describe as a misalignment, not dizziness, not confusion. Just the sense that my actions were slightly ahead of my awareness or behind it. I started double-checking everything, doors, times, names. At 1:42, I realized I was holding a pen and couldn't remember picking it up. The charting screen in front of me was filled out. Complete. My initials at the bottom. I didn't remember writing any of it. At 2:05, I went into room 409. He was standing by the wall, facing the corner. You're closer now, he said quietly. I asked him what he thought was happening to him. I don't disappear, he said. I just finished late. At 2:50, during rounds, I experienced something that still unsettles me more than any chart anomaly. I looked at the hallway clock and realized I didn't recognize the time it displayed. Not that I'd forgotten it, but that it didn't feel like it belonged to the night I was in. The documentation showed continuous care. No gaps, no alerts. At 3:30, he lay down and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly. In the morning, he remembered none of the overnight conversation. Psychiatry documented improvement. He was transferred to a step-down unit later that day. Before he left, as transport waited, he looked at me and said, almost gently, you should trust yourself less when everything lines up too well. I still believe in psychiatric diagnoses. I still trust observation, documentation, continuity of care. But I no longer assume awareness and attention move at the same speed. Some nights, I think patients aren't losing time at all. They're just noticing the moments when we haven't fully arrived yet.